I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My grandpa's wheelchair ramp, gone. Just a pile of broken wood and nails left behind. The HOA president, Greg, had ordered it demolished while my grandpa was at a doctor's appointment. No warning, no discussion. Just like that, he had taken away my grandpa's only way to get inside his own home. Greg had always been a pain. But this was pure evil. My grandpa, a Vietnam veteran, had lived in our neighborhood for over 20 years. Everyone knew him, respected him. He wasn't just another resident, he was a pillar of the community. And yet, that didn't stop Greg from flexing his HOA muscles in the worst way possible. When I confronted him, he smirked. The ramp was an unapproved structure, he said, violating HOA regulations. I told him my grandpa needed that ramp to get in and out of the house. His response? Not my problem. You should have applied for approval first. Approval? From him? The guy who rejected Christmas decorations for being too festive? The same guy who fined people for leaving their trash cans out 10 minutes too long? There was no way he would have ever approved the ramp, and we both knew it. My grandpa, confused and frustrated, sat in his wheelchair staring at where the ramp used to be. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was hurt. Not just physically. This was a humiliation. He had fought for his country, worked his entire life, paid his dues, and now some wannabe dictator with a clipboard had decided he didn't deserve basic accessibility. I wasn't going to let that stand. First, I went to the HOA board. They shrugged. Greg followed protocol. That's all they cared about, protocol. Not my grandpa, not his struggles. Just rules written by people who had never had to push a wheelchair up a flight of stairs. Then I tried the city. Maybe there was an ADA law that could help us. The official I spoke to was sympathetic, but said the HOA had legal authority over external structures. My only real option? Sue. And lawsuits. Take time my grandpa didn't have, so I decided to go a different route. I started digging. Who was Greg, really? What gave him the right to rule over our neighborhood like some third-world dictator? And that's when I found something interesting. Turns out, Greg wasn't just an HOA president. He was running for state office. Yep, he was trying to climb the political ladder, using the HOA as his personal playground to showcase his leadership skills. He had plans to move way beyond our little community. And suddenly, I had an idea. This wasn't just about my grandpa anymore. This was about making sure someone like Greg never got the power he was craving. But first, I needed to hit him where it hurt. If Greg wanted power, then I'd make sure everyone saw exactly the kind of leader he was. I started by gathering evidence. I spoke with neighbors who had their own horror stories, ridiculous fines, denied approvals, and selective enforcement of rules. I found an elderly woman Greg had harassed over a flower bed that wasn't HOA compliant. Another family had been fined for their kids' bikes being left on the driveway for too long. Everyone had a Greg story, and they were all sick of him. Then I found something golden. A former HOA treasurer, someone who had quit after clashing with Greg, told me that our HOA funds were suspiciously low. Apparently, Greg had been authorizing maintenance projects that never seemed to happen. Sounded like embezzlement to me. Now I had enough to cause some real damage. I created a website exposing Greg's abuses, complete with testimonials from neighbors, and screenshots of his absurd emails. But the real bombshell? I filed a formal complaint with the city, alleging financial mismanagement within the HOA. That triggered an audit, and, let's just say, things got messy fast. At first, Greg didn't take it seriously. He thought I was just some angry homeowner throwing a tantrum. But then, the local news picked up the story. One of my neighbors had a cousin working at a news station, and when they heard about Greg's antics, especially the part about tearing down a disabled veteran's wheelchair ramp, they ran with it. And let me tell you, people were furious. The story spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about the ramp anymore. It was about corruption, abuse of power, and a man who thought he was untouchable. And the best part? Greg's campaign for state office was in full swing. He was hosting fundraisers, shaking hands, pretending to be a man of the people. Imagine his face when reporters started grilling him about why he tore down a disabled veteran's wheelchair ramp. He tried to spin it, of course. He claimed it was about safety and proper procedures. But no one was buying it. AITA. Comments on his campaign page were brutal. People were calling him a tyrant, a fraud, a disgrace. Then came the audit results. Turns out, Greg had been playing fast and loose with HOA funds. He had overpaid contractors, who conveniently happened to be his friends, spent HOA money on personal business expenses, and even funneled some cash into his campaign. That was enough to get the state involved. Now Greg wasn't just dealing with bad press. He was looking at criminal charges, and I wasn't done yet. Greg thought he could survive the bad press. He still had connections, still had money backing his campaign. He figured that if he just waited it out, people would forget. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I kept digging. And that's when I found something even worse. Remember those shady HOA maintenance projects? The ones Greg had been funneling money into? Well, turns out they weren't just scams, they were bribes. Greg had been paying off key people in the local government, inspectors, zoning officials, anyone who could make his life easier. That's how he got away with so much nonsense. That's why the city never questioned his ridiculous HOA enforcement. He had bought their silence, and then I found the email. A leaked email from Greg's campaign manager showed that Greg had big plans for when he got elected. He wasn't just running for state office to serve the people. No, he was planning to rewrite zoning laws to benefit his real estate buddies. He had deals lined up to buy cheap land, rezone it, and flip it for millions, all while using his position to crush anyone who got in his way. This wasn't just about a power-hungry HOA president anymore. This was about deep corruption, fraud, and abuse of office. So, I did what any reasonable person would do. I sent everything to the press. The leaked emails, the bribes, the shady deals. It all went straight to a journalist who specialized in political corruption. And when the story dropped, Greg's career exploded into flames. At first, he tried to deny it. He claimed the emails were fake, that this was a politically motivated attack. But then, his campaign manager flipped on him. Turns out, the guy wasn't about to go down with the ship. He admitted to everything. How? Greg had planned the real estate scam, how he had been bribing officials, and how the HOA was just a stepping stone for his bigger political ambitions. And just like that, Greg went from a rising political star to a disgraced fraud under investigation. But my favorite part? The local government, now under pressure, forced the HOA to replace my grandpa's wheelchair ramp at Greg's personal expense. Poetic justice? Oh, we weren't done yet. Greg's downfall was happening fast, but I wanted to make sure he felt every second of it. The audit results had already put him in hot water. The leaked emails had nuked his political career. But now? Now it was time for the public humiliation. The HOA called for an emergency meeting, and let me tell you, it was packed. Homeowners who had been afraid to speak out before were now ready for war. Greg showed up looking like a cornered animal, sweating through his cheap suit. He still had a few supporters, mostly his buddies who had profited from his scams, but the rest of the room, They wanted blood. The HOA board had no choice but to let the homeowners speak. And, oh, did they speak? One by one, neighbors exposed Greg's corruption, his bullying, the way he had used his position to make people's lives miserable. The elderly woman with the non-compliant flower bed, she stood up and said how Greg had threatened to fine her into foreclosure. The family with the kids' bikes, they revealed how Greg had actually called the towing company to remove them. And then, it was my turn. I walked up, pulled out a printed copy of the leaked emails, and read them aloud. Every single line. Greg's face turned ghost white. People gasped. Others cheered. Some just sat there, shaking their heads, realizing that they had let this guy run wild for too long. Greg snapped. He tried to defend himself, saying it was all a setup, that he was the victim here. But the HOA board, seeing that their own necks were now on the line, turned on him instantly. Effective immediately, Greg is removed as HOA president. The room erupted in applause, but I wasn't done. I leaned in just enough so he could hear me over the cheering. Hope you saved up, Greg. Lawyers are expensive. Because, oh yeah, the state was pressing charges. Greg had committed financial fraud, bribery, and election violations. That wasn't just an HOA problem. That was a felony problem. And just when he thought it couldn't get worse, the State Bar Association started looking into him. See, Greg had been bragging about his law degree for years, but turns out he wasn't even a licensed attorney. He had a degree but never actually passed the bar, meaning he had been illegally giving legal advice as HOA president. That was the final nail in his coffin. The man who tore down my grandpa's wheelchair ramp because of rules was now drowning in legal trouble because he broke every rule in the book. And I just sat back and watched it all burn. Greg's fall from power was beautiful. His political campaign, dead. His HOA reign, over. His legal troubles, just beginning. The last time I saw him in the neighborhood, he was packing up his house, trying to sell it before the HOA lawsuits and state charges wiped him out completely. I made sure to give him a friendly wave as he drove off. He didn't wave back. But that wasn't even the best part. See, after Greg was kicked out, the HOA underwent a complete overhaul. The homeowners, finally free from his nonsense, voted to remove most of his ridiculous rules. They even changed the bylaws so that no HOA president could have unchecked power again. And my grandpa, oh, he got his ramp back. But not just any ramp. The new HOA board wanted to make a statement, so they funded a brand-new, custom-built wheelchair ramp for my grandpa, complete with handrails, non-slip coating, and a small garden next to it in his honor. The best part? They named it after him. A little plaque next to the ramp now reads, "The John Reynolds Ramp," a tribute to a man who stood tall, even in a wheelchair. That moment? That's when I knew we had won. As for Greg? Well, his legal battle drained his accounts, and when the fraud charges stuck, he lost his ability to run for office. Last I heard, he was living in a small rental, trying to stay under the radar. No more HOA power, no more political dreams, just a washed-up fraud who thought he was untouchable. And every time I see my grandpa roll up that ramp, smiling like he just won the lottery, I remind myself of one thing. Some people think they can bully their way to the top, but when they mess with the wrong person, they crash all the way down. A few months after Greg's spectacular downfall, life in the neighborhood felt lighter. No more absurd fines, no more ridiculous HOA meetings filled with fear and tension. People actually started talking to each other again, realizing how much control Greg had over their lives. My grandpa? He was thriving. With his new ramp, he got outside more, chatting with neighbors and enjoying the fresh air. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch, he looked at the plaque with his name on it and chuckled. "Never thought I'd get my name on something. Without dying first," he joked. I laughed, but deep down, I knew how much it meant to him. Then, something unexpected happened. A local veterans group heard about what happened and reached out. They wanted to feature my grandpa's story in an awareness campaign about accessibility rights for disabled veterans. Before we knew it, his face was on newsletters, websites, even a short documentary about fighting against unfair HOA practices. The best part? The city passed a new ordinance protecting accessibility structures from HOA interference, meaning no other HOA president could ever do what Greg did again. As for Greg himself, I checked in on him once, purely out of curiosity. Turns out, he tried to move to another HOA-controlled neighborhood, but the second they Googled his name, they rejected his application. Nobody wanted a disgraced fraud in charge of their community. Now, he's living in some cheap apartment complex, working as a legal assistant since he never actually became a real lawyer. No power, no influence, just a bitter man with nothing left. And honestly, that's the perfect punishment because men like Greg don't fear jail. They don't fear fines. They fear irrelevance, and that's exactly what he got.